But first of all, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. This really means a lot to us here at the National Community Review Board. This is a very important project we're working on, this MNPD zero-tolerance sexual misconduct policy, and we have a lot of stake in the matter, and we hope you all do too as members of the national community. So we'll go through a brief agenda for what we'll be talking about tonight. We'll start with an introduction of everyone at this table. Then we'll have Ansley, the lead researcher, who will go into the background of why this policy is important and needed for Nashville. Then I will go ahead and talk about the content of the policy itself. Then from there, we'll go into a Q&A about the policy and a group discussion as a community. And then from there, we'll go into different breakout sections where folks at each table will get a different policy section or sections to talk about, and then we'll all come back together as a group and talk about what you think is needed or should be added or changed from your policy section. And then finally, we'll do a brief conclusion on the next steps of the report, future research section. And finally, we'll do a brief conclusion on the next steps of the report, future research section. These excuses are technical. I think they're solved. But yes, we'll end with a brief conclusion where we'll talk about next steps, future research, and our recommendations for MNPD about this policy. And finally, before we begin introductions, each table should have a series of policy handouts at them. That's for you all to follow along with. So that is the actual policy that we are working on a draft for right now. So I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to my colleague, Ansley.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Okay, sounds good. My name is Ansley Potter. I am relatively new to staff of the NCRB. I started in late June, but my background is in research, not only in cognitive psychology, but also linguistics and sociolinguistics. And I am excited to be part of this team and excited to for you guys to hear about all of the hard work we put into this policy proposal.
Hello, so my name is Dylan DePriest. I'm the policy analyst with the NCRB. I've been with the org for about a year and a half so far. I enjoy working in the policy sphere, especially around criminal justice. Prior to this role, I got my master's degree from Vanderbilt University and my undergraduate from Vanderbilt University as well. And in both of those degrees, I focused on criminal justice and what it can look like to become more democratic and have more community involved in the deliberation and creation of criminal justice policies. So I'm very excited to be here. This report came with a lot of work and a lot of research, so we're very happy to share it with you all. And it couldn't have been possible without our executive director, Jill Fisher. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm very excited about this evening. And as Dylan and Ansley said, this work is very important. This policy has been a labor of love. It was very necessary through the process. We, as a COB and now a CRB, we saw a need for this policy. I'll let them explain a little bit more about the background, so I won't go into it. But everyone in this room, I think that you will be pleased with this, but we want your feedback, we want your input. It's important to us as a city that we have a policy that protects people who are not a part of the department, but also those who work within the department. And so thank you all for being here. I'm Jill Fisher, the Executive Director. I'm going to pass it on to my board member, but I wanted to just acknowledge the board members that are here. And thank you all for coming. That's Judge Brown, Sean Witzel, our chair, is on her way. And then, of course, I see a lot of familiar faces, and I just want to thank you all for being here.
Hello, my name is Mark Wynn, and I'm a member of the Community Review Board. I'm a former officer at Metro Police, and I'm happy that we're at this spot today. And not only want to spend a lot of time on this, so we can shut me up and stop talking about this topic, but this is an issue that this is what I do every day. I mean, I'm an advisor to the Justice Department, and I do work with them. I go into police departments around the country and analyze their policies, their training, their procedures, their lawsuits when they're sued, and I give them advice on how to raise their standard. And what I hope at the end of the day, and I'm confident the city will look at this and won't have an objection to it, because the three pillars of effective policing are: what are your standards, and what does your accountability look like, and how do you communicate that? And as you'll see when you see this policy, that it answers all three of those. The accountability is to the citizens, it's to every officer in the department, but especially, in my view, it's accountability to the young women, especially the young women. We're sitting in classrooms in Metro Public Schools today, trying to decide whether they want to be a Metro police officer in the next 15 to 20 years. And are they going to get a welcoming workplace or a hostile workplace? Because this is not theory. The Metro Police and all forms of government in this city have been hostile to women historically. We can talk about incidents if you like, that's my view on it. And the other is your standard. So how high is your standard? What are you willing not to do? And one of the things that we've seen around the country through the patterns and practice investigations at Justice has been this issue around gender violence. And we don't want Nashville to fall into that slump where the Justice Department's here to full complete investigation in our department. We want to fix it ourselves, and that's what the Community Review Board is all about. So I'm very happy to be here and happy to answer any questions about that.
Thank you for the introduction, everyone. We'll go ahead and hand it over to Ansley for the background on this policy.
All right. Sorry with that. So I wanted to first take over to define police sexual misconduct. This is a term which may be less familiar to some of the stricter legal terms, like sexual harassment or sexual assault. So the definition that you see on the screen has been provided by Tim Marr, who is a criminal justice professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis. He does a lot of research on police misconduct and has provided a lot of the research which, in the early 2000s, which we appreciated having. And so this definition brings up police sexual misconduct is behavior by an officer that takes advantage of the officer's position in law enforcement to misuse authority and power in order to commit a sexual act, initiate sexual contact with another person, respond to a perceived sexually motivated cue from another person, and it also includes any communication or behavior by an officer that would likely be construed as lewd, lascivious, inappropriate, or conduct that is unbecoming of officers. And so just because I know this definition is intentionally broad in its scope, I want to highlight some examples of behaviors that do fall under this definition of police sexual misconduct, such as sexual contact by force, so that's sexual assault, sexual shakedowns, which are instances where an officer might pull over an individual who is in a vulnerable position, for instance, somebody who was speeding, and say, hey, in exchange for sexual favor, I can let you off free without giving you a ticket, things like that. Gratuitous physical contact, sexually motivated voyeuristic actions, unnecessary contacts with civilians for sexually motivated reasons, and inappropriate use of department resources and information systems for sexually motivated reasons. And so a key element of this issue clearly is abuse of power or authority granted to police officers by the government. Police officers are charged with enforcing the laws, providing service, and maintaining order in a just manner. And as a result of this authority and trust placed in law enforcement officers to exercise their duties appropriately, police routinely work alone and without direct supervision, and they regularly interact with vulnerable citizens. Many of these encounters with civilians occur during midnight hours and in situations that are isolated from public scrutiny. While these circumstances are justified for the job and are necessary for officers to perform their duties, they also provide easy opportunities for the perpetration of sexual misconduct. And in fact, evidence from a study designed to understand the context in which police sexual violence occurs found that officers who are sexual predators do indeed tend to take advantage of the opportunities provided through those situational contexts. Most often, those they encounter through their traffic enforcement authority or the enforcement of laws designed to control the sex worker industry, or in situations in which they encounter minors who are vulnerable and easy to manipulate. And so with that being said, I do want to make a disclaimer here at this point that the goal of this report is not to assert that most police officers are bad actors who engage in predatory sexual behaviors. Most police officers, in fact, fulfill their duties honorably, and instances of police sexual violence are, compared to other types of police sexual misconduct, relatively rare. Instead, in this report, we want to highlight the responsibility of police agencies to prevent sexual predators who happen to be police officers from sexually degrading, violating, threatening, and assaulting citizens they are otherwise sworn to protect and serve. And so, to give you a little bit of the story of how we wound up here, proposing this policy to you all and hopefully soon to MNPD. Back on August 10th, 2020, almost exactly 4 years ago to the day, Nashville's then Mayor John Cooper publicly called for an investigation into a series of allegations of sexual misconduct brought against MNPD employees. These complaints were shared with him by an organization found no longer on behalf of I believe at least, it might be more than 19 women who shared that they had been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, or that they had experienced gender-based discrimination while under employment at MNPD. The investigation by the district attorney and by Metro Human Resources led to Mayor Cooper, including in the 2020 Policing Policy Commission report, more than 10 action items for MNPD to complete in order to achieve a workplace where sexual harassment and assault is not tolerated. Although each of these action items was given a completion timeline of 6 to 18 months, 4 years later, MNPD unfortunately has not adopted a zero tolerance policy around sexual assault and sexual harassment, which is a specific stipulation within the action item Policing Policy Commission report. Furthermore, it is the opinion of the NCRB that the steps they have taken to address the issue, while well-meaning and admirable, are inadequate as they do not address the scope of police sexual misconduct beyond sexual harassment in the workplace. And a look at some highly publicized incidents of police sexual misconduct within MNPD shows that this issue unfortunately continues 4 years later. 3 years ago for this first case. In 2023, a female former MNPD officer was awarded $300,000 in a lawsuit against MNPD after alleging that she faced retaliation and harassment for reporting the sexual harassment she experienced while working at MNPD. In 2024, a male officer was fired for appearing in OnlyFans promotional video where he parodied a sexual shakedown, which I briefly described to you before, a form of police sexual misconduct, unfortunately so common that it has a nickname. And it's basically, I already explained this to you. And so, this incident demonstrates instances where sexual violence may not occur, but an officer is using their colorable authority to coerce sexual contact in exchange for, receiving favorable treatment. And in addition to this unfavorable behavior, the officer was also wearing his MNPD badge and uniform and was using his MNPD patrol vehicle in the video. In May of this year, the NCRB, OPA, and the mayor's office received a 61-page whistleblower complaint filed by a former lieutenant within MNPD's OPA. He alleged that by design, the department has failed to implement an actual zero-tolerance policy on sexual harassment and discrimination, fails to properly communicate with or help employees affected by such conduct, and does not ensure violators cannot commit inappropriate conduct. The complaint also details specific allegations against MNPD officers, where certain high-ranking officers are found to be engaging in practices of repeated sexual misconduct and gender discrimination, yet received little disciplinary action. Often such officers were allowed to retain their positions and continue committing acts of misconduct. These three stories alone can demonstrate that within MNPD, there's a lack of training, sense of apathy, and a lack of accountability towards instances of sexual misconduct. Overall, this conduct is not representative of a workplace that shows zero tolerance for sexual misconduct. But police sexual misconduct is not a problem that is unique to Nashville. Police departments across Tennessee and across the nation have a history of police sexual misconduct and failing to appropriately handle sexual assault cases on behalf of civilians. So by adopting this zero-tolerance sexual misconduct policy, MNPD would in fact be a trailblazer for police departments across Tennessee and helping others to adopting national best practices. On a national scale, a study by the Associated Press found that roughly 1,000 officers lost their badges due to sexual misconduct violations in a 6-year period. And a database compiled by the Buffalo News reported that a law enforcement officer was caught in a case of sexual abuse or misconduct at least every 5 days over the course of 2005 to 2015. Finally, I want to note that assessing the prevalence of police sexual misconduct is extremely difficult. To start, sexual assault is by far the most underreported violent crime in our country, according to the Department of Justice, with only about 23% of sexual assaults being reported to the police. In addition to all of the barriers that anybody who experiences sexual violence feels, and all of the hesitancy and fear that comes with going to share your experience with the police and fearing that you won't be believed, or that nothing will come of the report, victims of sexual misconduct may be especially unlikely to report their experiences when they've experienced sexual assault on behalf of, at the hands of a police officer. And so as a result, they feel less safe going to the police to tell their story. And so as a result of the underreporting of police sexual misconduct, much of what we do know comes from publicized arrest reports from the most violent instances. So again, at this point, I would like to say that most instances of police sexual misconduct, while also reprehensible, tend to be less severe, non-violent instances of harassment and abuse and things like that, or sorry, abuse of resources and things like that, for sexually motivated reasons, and do not involve egregious instances of sexual violence. Nevertheless, studies of repeat offenders in police sexual violence demonstrate how vulnerable citizens pay the price when police agencies fail to adequately deal with officers who engage in police sexual violence. Rather shockingly, a study of 106 cases across the United States of police sexual violence found that 41.5% of those cases were perpetrated by a repeat offender. And furthermore, 72% of all victims accounted for across those 106 cases were victimized by repeat offenders. And that brings us to the other side of the coin with police sexual misconduct. So far we've covered police sexual misconduct with interactions with civilians. But an important piece to note as well is that many officers who work within police departments experience sexual harassment, gender-based discrimination, and sexual violence at the hands of their male colleagues. While sexual harassment is a prevalent issue nationwide, this is especially true for male-dominated professions, and is especially true for professions where aggression is highly valued. And so one might not be surprised to hear that police, the profession of law enforcement, deal with especially high rates of sexual harassment in the workplace. A closer look at the study, and studies trying to understand the scope of this issue within police departments demonstrate that although sexual harassment disproportionately affects female police officers, a significant percentage of male officers will appear to be affected as well. However, officers also tend, sadly, to underreport their experiences of sexual harassment. In addition to all of the fears of all individuals who refrain from reporting their encounters of sexual harassment or assault, female police officers also fear the consequences of reporting on a colleague and continuing to work in an office with a culture historically known for its blue-walled silence that values loyalty to other police officers over all else. And in a male-dominated profession, being that law enforcement is, many outnumbered female police officers may be hesitant to further ostracize themselves by reporting if they don't think that anything will happen within their department, or they fear losing their own jobs as a result. And so the prevalence and breadth of this issue of police sexual misconduct demonstrates that this is a systemic issue which cannot be cast off as a few bad apples taken poorly in an otherwise perfectly designed system. Rather, change must come from leadership within law enforcement agencies, pushed through by policy. Our graphic on the side here shows that unchecked police sexual misconduct has detrimental impacts on law enforcement agencies, the communities they serve, and the police officers who operate within those agencies. Law enforcement agencies strive for legitimacy, credibility, and trust in the communities they serve. And so when police sexual misconduct goes unchecked, the culture of police sexual misconduct within the department is normalized, the agency's legitimacy and trust erodes, victims are, as a result, more reluctant to go to that police department to report what happened to them, and perpetrators are not caught and continue to cause harm, and it perpetuates on and on. Contrastingly, having a robust policy stands to benefit everyone, law enforcement agencies themselves, the communities, and the police officers who work within those agencies. It stands to boost the trust and legitimacy of law enforcement agencies, stands to mitigate liability in lawsuits, which police departments often have to pay the cost. And it also, for a police department that hopes to increase its female workforce to 30% in the next 6 years, having a policy that shows that they're protected and will be backed by the standard operating procedures and the leadership within their department only stands to benefit the recruitment and retention of female officers. It's also protective for the community, as taking proactive measures and adopting policy always is intended to be preventative and not reactionary. And so with that, we propose the following zero tolerance sexual misconduct policy for MNPD to consider adopting for the health and safety of all Nash civilians. I'll hand it over to Dylan.
All right, thank you so much. Why the policy is so needed. Now we'll go into the policy itself as a solution to MNPD addressing sexual misconduct. So this policy is inspired by four main sources: End Violence Against Women International, the International Association of the Chiefs of Police, the Chicago Police Department, and COPA, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, which is Chicago's Community Oversight Board. So, a brief overview of the policy. First, we'll get into the purpose of it, then where the legal standing is, followed by victims' rights, prohibitions, preventions, procedures for investigating sexual misconduct, alternate options to report sexual misconduct, retaliation, training, recruitment, auditing, and then finally, collaboration with external organizations. So, to begin, the purpose of this policy is to eliminate any instances of sexual misconduct within MNPD to protect both the national community and officers within MNPD. This is especially relevant, as Anthony mentioned before, as MNPD attempts to get a 30% female officer staffing by 2030. While female officers are not only the victims of sexual misconduct, they are disproportionately affected by sexual misconduct, especially in the workplace. But it should be said that this policy is to protect all officers, no matter of their gender, sexuality, race, origin, etc. So we also want to make sure we focus on MNPD's approach to addressing sexual misconduct in the community, as well as how they handle sexual misconduct investigations with their officers, to focus on using trauma-informed practices. And finally, once again, the purpose of this policy is to help MNPD become a model police department for both Tennessee and the nation, and to address former Mayor Cooper's 2020 Policing Policy Commission's recommendation. So, first, a little brief history on the legal standing of where this policy lands. In terms of federal laws, Title 18 of the U.S. Constitution, Section 242, mentions acting under the color of law, which prohibits sexual conduct of any kind while acting as a law enforcement officer of the United States. And this applies not just to law enforcement personnel like police officers, but also to anyone who interacts with the criminal justice or policy system, judges, parole officers, correction officers, etc. And it importantly includes both on-duty acts and any off-duty conduct that has to do with MNPD property or MNPD privileges, anything that could relate to your status as an MNPD officer, even, once again, while off-duty. And this, can include visits to crime victims, witnesses, suspects, use of government vehicles or technology, and it's especially relevant when we talk about using information technology later to access individuals' personal and private information. Finally, it's important to note that acting under the color of law, consent is not an affirmative defense. So even if a sexual act is consensual, if an MNPD officer or law enforcement agency officer is acting under the color of law, that act cannot be consensual. And now we'll look a little bit into Tennessee laws. I won't go into all of them because there is a laundry list of statutory definitions of what Tennessee considers sexual and violent offenses. But what's important about these codes are that many of these codes include specific denotations for law enforcement officers. So basically, Tennessee laws themselves have specific sexual and violent offenses codes for law enforcement agencies. Next, we'll talk about victim rights. So, first and foremost, if any employee believes that they have been subject to sexual misconduct, that employee has the right to file a complaint with MNPD or an alternative reporting source, and we'll get more into those later in this policy. The victims also have the right to be treated with compassion, dignity, and respect, informed about services and resources, and walk through the process of reporting said sexual misconduct. They will also be provided with a copy of this policy so that they're aware of all the protections that they have and the processes in place, and they will be assured confidentiality in the process. And finally, MNPD will ensure that they will go through the necessary and reasonable actions to prevent further contact with the subject of the allegations for the complaint. So this could mean changing around patrol times, changing around A shift, B shift, C shift, potentially even changing precincts, anything that could be reasonable and necessary to move said complainant away from the alleged perpetrator. Next, we'll go into prohibitions. So, first and foremost, any criminal conduct of a sexual nature is explicitly prohibited. Engaging in sexual acts while on duty, once again, color of law prevents consent even while on duty from being an affirmative defense. Using MNPD property to engage in sexual misconduct. So this could look like using MNPD technology services to look up where someone lives, what someone's driver's license number is, if someone's been a victim to a sexual crime before or any other sort of crime, anything that relates to MNPD property that is supposed to assist them in law enforcement duties. This also includes possessing or sending sexually inappropriate material while on duty, and using one's position within MNPD as a law enforcement officer to solicit, initiate, or coerce sexual contact with anyone. Like Ansley mentioned in the background, this can include anything ranging from sexual shakedowns to bribes, threatening, withholding investigatory activity, or threatening legal action against someone. And finally, this includes unnecessary contact / inappropriate and unauthorized use of MNPD information resources with member of the community. So this could mean going back to talking with a crime victim who you took the statement of before. It could prevent, again, using information technology to look up where a crime victim lives or where a witness lives, etc. And then this also prohibits relationships that constitute a conflict of interest when working for MNPD. So this could include vulnerable populations, populations that an MNPD officer regularly oversees on their route. This actually wasn't a complaint that we were able to file with the NCRB, but last year we received a complaint anonymously from a social worker who reported that an MNPD officer was having a sexual relationship, an ongoing sexual relationship, with a member of the homeless community he was entrusted to protect. So that is one of the main reasons why we think this policy is important and why that prohibition especially is relevant. It also includes gratuitous physical contact with suspects or detainees, whether in or out of the squad car or detainment facilities. And finally, an important aspect that we think is important for prohibitions is to increase the amount of protections that LGBTQ community members have in our city. So we also want to prohibit unlawful search for the express purposes of assigning gender. Next, we'll move into prevention. So the first aspect of prevention that we think is crucial is mandatory reporting. And we really think this is important so that we can reduce the stigma that exists around reporting. Once again, in the background, we saw that roughly 75% of female officers in law enforcement agencies will receive some form of sexual misconduct directed at them in their career. However, that reporting number stands at just 12%. So there's a massive disparity between the perceived or the actual sexual misconduct that's happening and the perceived sexual misconduct that gets reported in law enforcement agencies. So we believe that mandatory reporting will help reduce that stigma and hopefully narrow that disparity. We also think it's important that we make sure that all of this is confidential, as this can be very sensitive in nature. So any personnel who receives a report of possible sexual misconduct shall not reveal any information about the report beyond what is required to fulfill mandatory reporting requirements, both on and off duty. So we really want to make sure that any officer or supervisor who receives a complaint of MNPD sexual misconduct tells only the information they need to only the amount of people who need to hear that information. Keep it as confidential as possible. We also want to make sure we can identify early warning signs. So this is not just related to sexual activity, but includes a wider scope of potential problematic behavior, like inappropriate use of force, misuse of MNPD property, once again, especially pertaining to MNPD investigatory or information technology, I can't speak, I'm so sorry. Suspicious patterns of practice, so this could look like pulling over certain demographics of individuals who would be considered vulnerable, patrolling certain areas heavier than others, especially if those areas are ones where sex workers tend to frequent, pulling over women you believe are intoxicated or otherwise impaired, etc. And this could also include inappropriate encounters with juveniles, like Anthony mentioned in the background. Juveniles themselves are a very vulnerable population when it comes to sexual misconduct, and officers have a lot of authority and leeway with their position. So we want to make sure that any inappropriate or otherwise unexplainable interactions with juveniles are identified. So, we also believe that it's important that employees and supervisors, in a moment, have very specific instructions and policies and procedures to follow if they want to report sexual misconduct, if they witness someone reporting sexual misconduct, or if they're just involved in the process in any way. So, this is really to ingrain sexual misconduct prevention into the typical duties of officers, once again, to really hammer down on breaking that stigma of reporting. We also believe that command staff and supervising officers have extra responsibilities that other MNPD officers might not have that are crucial to document when talking about sexual misconduct prevention. So we believe that supervising officers should conduct various oversight across the officers they oversee to identify some of these early warning symbols that we talked about before. We also want to make sure that they can take immediate supervisory action to address any sexual misconduct when they see those warning signs. And we want to give them special guidelines for what to do when receiving a report. So the first aspect is we always want to make sure that supervisors then complain. Reporting sexual misconduct is not an easy task, certainly when it affects your career, your livelihood, and potentially your relationship with other officers in the department. So we want to make sure that supervisors are really, again, centering the process around the victim of sexual misconduct. We also want them to refer the complaint to the appropriate parties, so whether those are members within MNPD or in external organizations around National Health, we want to make sure that the victim is getting the appropriate help and support that they need throughout this difficult process. We also want them to notify the appropriate chain of command as soon as possible, but once again, focus on telling the least amount of people possible. And we also want them to evaluate the appropriate resources and steps necessary to conduct a thorough investigation. We'll go into a little bit about the importance of this step when we talk about the steps that MNPD needs to take for investigating sexual misconduct a bit later in this presentation. And finally, we want them to secure any evidence and identify possible or potential witnesses as soon as possible. As once again, timing is really important in these cases. And just having evidence and witnesses identified as soon as possible goes a long way in making sure an investigation can actually take place and can be timely. So, as we move into procedures for investigating sexual misconduct, the first aspect is to determine if the alleged misconduct is administrative in nature, or criminal in nature, or both. In the event of a criminal investigation, we want MNPD to conduct a preliminary investigation that will take place over the course of 3 to 7 days to determine if there is a basis for a full criminal investigation. We want this preliminary investigation to be efficient, swift, just, And this is really important to deter one of the most common aspects of sexual misconduct investigations not going through, and that's witness tampering. It's also to reduce the pariah status of individuals awaiting judgment and to reduce the liability of keeping a potentially criminally implicated officer active. In some other instances around the country, we've seen that officers who have been identified as suspect in sexual misconduct allegations have actually been kept on the force during the entirety of those investigations and have assaulted more people during that time period on. Specifically, in one egregious Oklahoma case, which we can talk about another time. Finally, in some cases, we believe that MNPD may need to hand over investigative authority to an external agency. This could be the TBI, the district attorney's office, etc. And then we as a CRB, even if it's an external organization investigating the specific aspect of sexual allegations, we would still review that agency's investigation since it pertains to MNPD conduct. And examples for this could be when MNPD resources are limited, someone of high rank is implicated, and or to avoid any sort of conflict of interest if they may arise. Next, let's talk about alternative options for reporting sexual misconduct. Once again, sexual misconduct in law enforcement settings is significantly underreported. You will hear that at lunch tonight, and I'm sure you will hear that in the future. This is really the core of what we're trying to address here. And so we want other agencies around Tennessee to be able to offer alternative ways to report sexual misconduct for those who do not feel comfortable addressing it within MNPD. Once again, the goal here is to really reduce that stigma of reporting sexual misconduct and trying to narrow down that disparity of sexual misconduct that happens and gets reported. So this applies to both MNPD officers and members of the community who believe they have been the victim of sexual misconduct by MNPD officers. We believe that some of these following agencies and organizations could provide some helpful support, resources, and referrals to those who want to report said misconduct. The CRB, that's us. Silent No Longer Tennessee, the Sexual Assault Center of Tennessee, and the Office of Family Safety. Next, we want to talk about retaliation. As Anthony mentioned before, in some of the background of why this policy is so important, in the 2023 case where a former MNPD officer won a lawsuit with the city for retaliatory behavior that was conducted against her after reporting sexual misconduct. So some of that retaliatory behavior included the DA leveraging false charges against her so that she could drop her sexual misconduct allegation, and other MNPD officers following her while she was at home, running personal errands, and on duty. So we really want to make sure that any member of the community or MNPD who reports sexual misconduct shall be protected from retaliation, as we've seen it happen in the past. This includes witnesses to sexual misconduct allegations as well, as we once again really want to focus on reducing witness tampering when it comes to sexual misconduct investigations. So retaliation can look like a number of things and includes discouragement, intimidation, coercion, or otherwise adverse action. It's important to note that while the accused does have a constitutional right to talk or converse with their accuser under the Sixth Amendment, that right can be forfeited by wrongdoing, which includes retaliatory behavior and witness tampering. Any MNPD personnel found responsible for retaliatory behaviors will be subject to disciplinary action up to and including suspension, termination, and or decertification, as we believe this is both a very serious and very important aspect of the sexual misconduct process that we want to make sure does not happen to anyone. Next, we'll talk a little bit about training. We believe that MNPD officers learn a lot when they're in the training facilities, and they take that knowledge and they use it throughout the rest of their MNPD career and other law enforcement careers if they go to other organizations. So we believe that making sure that trainees going through the MNPD program have the best training and knowledge they can about police sexual misconduct and how to avoid it and identify it in other aspects of their career. So we want to incorporate the following topics into required training for new and existing officers. Defining police sexual misconduct, really focusing on that color of the law piece of being a police officer, having case examples of both on and off duty violations, and identifying predatory behavior and early warning signs. We also want to make sure trainees are educated about mandatory reporting responsibilities, and once again, we want to make sure that just mandatory reporting and training about mandatory reporting are just completely ingrained in the everyday duties of MNPD officers to reduce that stigma of reporting and make the process less difficult. We also think it's important to include bias trainings. That can include gender bias trainings and triggers of bias, as individuals, especially law enforcement officers, might not realize that actions they're taking could be considered bias. We also want to make sure that MNPD officers are trained and educated on the contents of the policy. And we really want to incorporate external agencies into the training process as well. This is both a chance to increase collaboration between MNPD and the greater national community, but to really bring in educated and experienced individuals and organizations about certain topics into the training program so that MNPD officers can get the best training possible from subject matter experts. This was actually a practice that was more prevalent in MNPD training prior to 2020, but the pandemic really affected MNPD's training staff's ability to go into different segments of the community and into different areas to receive training. So we really want to make sure this practice comes back, as we think it's very important to increasing exposure for vulnerable communities and just, once again, building trust between MNPD and the community. Similar to training, we want to make sure that there are specific recruitment protocols that are followed to address police sexual misconduct. So we want to have thorough applicant screenings for all new recruits and lateral transfers. So that includes every officer who comes to MNPD from a different department. And so we really want to make sure that that process screens an applicant from their entire lives upon turning 18. We believe that this is necessary to have a thorough, contextual screening of an applicant and identify any sort of potential warning signs that could turn into potential police sexual misconduct, or to identify any past instances of police sexual misconduct and make sure that those instances are addressed or that that individual is not chosen to become an MNPD officer. As part of that process, we want to make sure that we look at all disciplinary records from previous departments for lateral transfers as well. And so, as part of the post-conditional officer offer of employment, we want to include psychological screenings that go over potential warning signs of sexual misconduct. MNPD already does psychological screenings, but we believe that expanding that process to include some of the warning signs we identified before would be extremely helpful in reducing aspects of sexual misconduct. For any candidate that has any previous indicators of abusive tendencies or sexual misconduct in other departments or other careers prior to becoming a law enforcement agency, we want MNPD to give them a no hire decision. Next, we'll talk about auditing. So we want to make sure that there's a post-incident audit for every single alleged instance of police sexual misconduct that gets filed with MNPD or at an external organization via referral of MNPD. So OPA will maintain investigative files for sexual misconduct reporting, including a de-identifiable number. This de-identifiable number will be very useful for us as a CRB to review cases and for other external support and advocacy agencies to be able to provide support without necessarily having to reveal confidential information or any information that someone who was the victim of sexual misconduct may want to reveal. An after-incident review will be conducted at the conclusion of every investigation, both administrative and criminal in nature, by the CRB. This will include any case that is considered unfounded as well. Next, we want to make sure that there is an integrity audit that happens. While the post-incident audit will be on a case-by-case basis, the incident audit will be a process that MNPD and the CRB will do collaboratively on an annual basis to make sure that we are working together to identify any sort of behavior that could be considered sexual misconduct. We want to make sure that the quality of sexual misconduct investigations are high, that sexual misconduct investigations are being thoroughly reviewed, and we want to make sure that this policy is a living document so that we can recommend changes in policies and practice to curtail police sexual misconduct for years to come. So if this means adopting new policies or practice based on what we learn throughout implementing this policy, then we believe that that would be a very worthwhile and important aspect of this audit. Finally, the integrity audit will include aggregate data on all the investigations reviewed that will be made publicly on MNPD's data dashboard, with those de-identifiable certification numbers, as once again, we know that this is a very sensitive area and involves a lot of personal vulnerability and information. So we want to make sure we keep it as confidential as possible. So we believe that collaborating with external organizations is core to building trust with the national community, but also making sure that we have the most resources and best support networks available for those who are the victims of police sexual misconduct. Once again, we really want to focus on reducing that disparity between the amount of police sexual misconduct that happens and the amount that gets reported. So we believe that collaboration with external organizations is key to narrowing that disparity. Once again, some local organizations could include us as a CRB, Silent No Longer Tennessee, the Sexual Assault Center of Nashville, the Office of Family Safety, and others around Nashville, especially organizations that work with different populations as well. Sexual misconduct is an interdisciplinary and intersectional topic, and so if that means working with local organizations that work with specific vulnerable populations as well, then we think that would be very worthwhile for conducting sexual misconduct investigations. So finally, that brings us to the community aspect of this policy. This report, at the end of the day, is not just for us as the CRB, or even for MNPD as a law enforcement agency, but really to protect and empower the community. So we want to make sure that we are building those collaborations between the CRB, MNPD, community organizations, and community members so that everyone feels empowered and like they have a stake in public safety in Nashville. So, as we have spread more outreach about this policy and this project, we've received a lot of comments and feedback from members of the community who have come forward to share their feedback for the policy with us, and in some cases even share and report aspects of police sexual misconduct to us. So that can range from being the victim of police sexual misconduct or having a sexual misconduct case not thoroughly or adequately investigated by MNPD. So the more we've gone out in the community and shared our policy, the more stories and cases we've heard about that come forward. So while all of those instances are of course problems that we need to address with MNPD, it's been really encouraging to see our work turn into collaboratory relationships where folks who might not have even known about the CRB feel empowered to come forward and share their stories. We really look forward to incorporating all of your feedback from this event into our final draft as well. So once again, thank you all for being here. It really means a lot to us. And for those of you who are watching remotely via our live, or who told us they did not attend but were fully supporting this policy and have sent us feedback, we again really appreciate all the time and effort you put into helping us through this process. So, in a brief conclusion to this policy, we'll talk a little bit about next steps. So, like I mentioned before, we want to incorporate all the feedback we get from this event and from the community who did not attend this event into the final iteration of this policy. We will then present a final draft, the CRB, on Monday, August 26th, 2024, at our August board meeting. We encourage all of you to attend. And finally, once or if that final draft gets board approval, we will upload that final draft to the NCRB's website on national.gov, and we will share a link to that later on our socials. One thing to note, all our research drafts and policy drafts that we upload to NCRB's website are ADA accessible. Finally, once that process is done, we will issue one recommendation to MNPD that they adopt our zero tolerance sexual misconduct policy. Finally, while this policy and the research that's gone into it covers many areas, it can still cover more. There's aspect of sexual misconduct, especially related to law enforcement, that spans into almost every single aspect of our lives and the duties of law enforcement officers. So there's a lot of room for future research here, namely two important topics: trauma-informed care and domestic violence. These topics were originally actually included in this report and the policy, but those sections became so large and important on their own that we believed it would be best to make those into future research reports as standalone, but obviously connected and intersectional topics. So, thank you all so much for listening. We really appreciate you all being here, and we'll hand it over to you all for questions.
I just want to say for those who are watching, if you have any feedback and you can't attend, you can always upload your information, questions, or feedback in our chat section, comment section. Thank you.
Go ahead and give it the mic.
Do we have, why don't we, yes.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to comment on the report. It seems very thorough. I did have a question specifically about some of the categories or communities that may have particular concerns. I'm thinking specifically of communities that are hearing impaired or visually impaired, communities that may speak different languages but have concerns about cultural competency and connection. Also individuals of marginalized and minoritized communities who may also be in other intersectional communities, specifically those who are LGBTQIA. Are there opportunities for those folks to be able to submit reports that are specifically individuals who might be able to speak to the various entities?
Can you repeat that last part? You cut it in and out a little bit.
Sorry about that. Just specifically to speak to the issue of intersectionality to many different communities.
One sec, I think let's actually switch out that mic with the question. Apologies, do you mind repeating the last part of your question one more time?
Hello? Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so specifically speaking to the issue of intersectionality, individuals who touch other communities, is there an opportunity or a way for those folks to
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, we really think that this issue is intersectional. So thank you for highlighting that and bringing it up. We reached out to a whole list of organizations around Nashville about this issue, and one of the important criteria for who we reached out to were, the populations that they were working with, especially those who are disproportionately targeted for sexual misconduct. So we looked at, different ethnic and language groups, LGBTQ organizations, disability organizations, to really get their input and feedback on this policy. So one interaction that I think was really helpful for building out this policy was we met with Dr. Marissa Richmond, who is a very prominent gender and sexuality scholar, who has since retired from being a professor, but helped tremendously with this report, especially in building out the LGBTQ sections of those protections and policies we put in the report. We really believe that this issue extends to everyone in Nashville, regardless of what demographic or abilities you might have. So we really encourage anyone and all groups to contact us with feedback, because it only helps us make sure we're covering all of our bases. I don't know.
Yeah, and once this policy is adopted and it becomes a policy and we upload it, we are working towards like our translation services to have these types of things translated and on our website for those who might want to review it, get some understanding about it. So that's still an option that we have. Of course, right now the build out, I think, especially with those agencies, we're kind of relying on them to share it. So like Turk and Conexion and a host of others. I think we sent out about maybe 30 to 40 invitations to different community organizations, like you said earlier. So,
and one thing to note too, for the policy itself that we'll upload to the NCRB's website, that we always make sure is ADA compliant, so that the document and the policy itself is accessible to everyone who wants to read it.
So I have a question. So if a person has filed a complaint and at the right time and stuff, and it hasn't moved, and the officer that's investigated it left it alone, but that case has never moved, it's just sitting there. Is there a timeline that you all put something in there about how long it can sit, or if it hasn't been dealt with?
so on our end, so that's a really good question. On our end, as it pertains to the review of cases, of course, we are limited by the law. There's all kind of host of reasons why a case would sit. Sometimes like they're still looking for a suspect or a person who's a perpetrator. And so I think that we can enhance that area of it, and I think that that's a good opportunity for feedback when we're having our small table discussions. Because at this point, from my understanding, usually when it goes through OPA, there's a 45-day, but that's for sexual misconduct within. If it's a case that a person, what you're talking about is if you filed something about a sexual misconduct report, or whether you were a victim of sexual misconduct, then that would go to a detective, and they have different time frames. And so there has to be some kind of collaboration and coordination regarding what those cases look like, and at this point we don't have that answer specifically, but I think it is an opportunity for us to enhance our policy with that.
Yeah, I will say too, some of the NCRB complaints that we've received about MNPD sexual misconduct have been about MNPD investigating sexual misconduct cases of community members inadequately. And so that can include, and has included in some of our cases, you know, a case just sitting on a desk for a year with nothing happening to it, or just other egregious time points. So that is absolutely a valid complaint to bring to us as well if you're a member of the community who feels like their case has not been adequately investigated by MNPD.
Hello.
Hi. I'm just going to piggyback on to what you just said because that's kind of the realm of like what I've experienced, and so I was curious as to where the mishandling of like sexual misconduct comes into play if it is a suspect that isn't an MNPD officer or an investigator, but the officer and the investigator are the one that are mishandling the case, and where that essentially falls within this policy or if it's going to be in a different policy, just so like, I guess the overarching idea in my head is like, how are we supposed to entrust accountability within an agency that doesn't hold each other accountable for those things to then protect the community from those things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and accountability is super important. I think hopefully, at least indirectly, if not specifically addressed in the policy, that some of the training and recruitment practices that we're proposing, particularly as they pertain to trauma-informed responses to victims, gender bias training, how to detect early warning signs, and that one's not really that relevant, but I think with a lot of gender bias training within policing comes a sensitivity to how how sexual assault and domestic violence cases are often pushed aside or mishandled or considered not as serious as other types of violent crime. And so we took a lot of our recommendations from the Department of Justice recommendations and the International Association of Chiefs of Police recommendations for how police agencies can better address domestic violence and crimes that disproportionately affect women and children. And so the hope with us doing that is that, these crimes will be taken as seriously, whether they are perpetuated by a member of MNPD or a member of the community. Hopefully that will be addressed in that manner.
Add something to that. I think it's really disheartening when a person makes that complaint to the police and it just sits on someone's desk. I mean, it's unacceptable, right? It just really is. And so, I mean, I think that there are some ways that we can audit some of that information to determine whether or not they are, we would like to know, like, why would it be sitting there? Like, where is the ball being dropped, if that's the case? It could be that they are trying to identify who a perpetrator is, but if it's found that that's not what they're doing and the case is just went cold for whatever other reasons, whether it be a DNA sample, whether it be whatever the case is, I think that the person who has made the report, the victim in the case, should be having regular check-ins to know what's happening with their case, or have an advocate doing that work for them. And so if that's an experience that is happening regularly, which we have identified that has happened multiple occasions, the complainant has contacted us. And so I think that is something that definitely has to be addressed, but I think that is going to probably fall under auditing, because I don't know exactly where it would fit anywhere else at this point, especially since it's already been filed. I think that there is another opportunity for that person, if there has been a perpetrator identified and nothing has happened, to reach out to the DA's office, and maybe a liaison there to see like what is the issue. But you can always, of course, can follow up with us as well to make those calls and stand in the gap for the person.
I want to add one thing too. There's a lot of misconceptions about sex assault, not the public or law enforcement. The one that's been the biggest obstacle for policing has been false reporting. And the myths that speak for all these other groups in the community, but I'm sure that the Rape Crisis Center, the Domestic Violence Center, any of these programs that do direct service to the victims of domestic and sexual violence, all, if you were to poll them and say, do you agree with this policy of the police department, would say yes, but they're not here today. And one of the reasons that often happens is that with a community that tries to do a better job in all these interpersonal violence crimes, the ingredient is partnerships and trusting relationships with law enforcement. Law enforcement sometimes looks at oversight as adversarial. So the very nature of the relationship of a nonprofit that works in these fields now has to take a stand that says, we're your partners in the day-to-day operations in working with these crime victims, but we also want to hold your own officers accountable. So some communities just have not been able to have that courageous conversation to say that there's no double standard here. And for us to trust you, we have to know that you'll deal with your own just like you do the general public. So, having said that, I think eventually that if this policy goes through, and I hope it does with your approval and the rest of your approval, that all those nonprofits who aren't here today will say, yes, we do agree with this. And then maybe down the line, it'll open up the door so we can have another conversation about the community's view of police operations in day-to-day in Nashville.
And then I suppose I'll round out the whole panel by also answering that question. I believe that that is absolutely one of the most important aspects of the work we're doing here. And I think that's the core of that, really that future research report with that trauma-informed care section. As that was originally part of this, as that, the trauma-informed care aspect of it is really trying to center in on how MNPD actually investigates these sort of instances in the community, how they investigate it, amongst themselves, and do practices that really focus on, believing victims and adequately spending time and resources on those cases. So, to answer your question, I think from a policy aspect, in this policy, the aspect that most pertains to addressing those sort of issues are, like Jill mentioned before, kind of the post-audit instances and the integrity audits to make sure that the department themselves is adequately handling sexual misconduct investigations, both within the organization and within the community. But I think that's really the core part of the future policy and research of the trauma-informed care section, as that one will really focus on what MNPD's interactions should look like with victims who have been sexually assaulted or the victims of sexual misconduct in the community, and making sure that those cases are adequately handled.
I'm not sure. Oh, I feel like this is a question of power, fundamentally. I'm so appreciative of Councilperson Evans for being here. Thank you. I wish more council people were here. It was 4 years ago when Silent No Longer came forward, and folks who tried to gather around and do some pushing about this, both the Community Oversight Board as well as people in the community, I think, came up against this issue of power. And when you talk about the organizations not being here, they don't feel like they have any power in relationship to NNPD. They just don't. I think the community oversight now has continually been disempowered by the police department. They've been ignored, they've been abused verbally for their efforts to create an oversight board. And I do believe fundamentally the community does not believe it is sharing power with NNPD. And I think that's critical. This report is phenomenal. I have small little things I'd like to give you feedback about. The policy is phenomenal. You have done an incredible job of going out and really researching what is needed. And I would be shocked if the Community Review Board did not vote to put this policy forward to MNPD. But I think it does a bit of a disservice, and I don't think it was intended in any way, but I am concerned as a CUNY member that there's not some concrete ways that may come forward as recommendations about how to put some hands around this thing. And the thing that comes to my mind, just because my mind works in an organizing way, I made a short list. There's a list in here of organizations, and then there's more that have been brought up as real stakeholders. But more than that, they really are guardians in our community, right? So we, on the police cars, it says your guardians. Well, great. But these groups are also guardians. And I think the power about how to make this a reality has to be one of shared responsibility and power. And so, for me as a CUNY member, I just want to put out for you a recommendation, which is, yes, the policy, and that MNPD accept the policy and integrate it into all their trainings, and that's great. I love it. It's great. It's so important. But to me, it's on the ground. Like, how does it really operate on the ground? And I think that Metro Council, particularly the Women's Caucus within Metro Council, needs to grab this, like really grab it, and make it fun. Actually set some money aside for a staff person within the Community Review Board that works with all these groups, these stakeholders, and they sit down as equal members of an oversight group that meets with MNPD about how literally you are implementing these things. And when complaints come up, they're bringing complaints, but they're also listening to the complaints. There's more complaints. There's so many more complaints. And the fact that these groups are outside the police department, women within the police department, why just having a policy will that lead them to report? I mean, I just am like, I don't see it happening unless they really see there is shared power of the guardians in this community with MNPD. I will just stop there. And thank you for giving me a minute to speak to that.
Yeah, I'd like to just say one thing about that. So when our first policy that we created I think it had like over 33 recommendations. And when we were talking about that particular policy, I was really concerned that they would have the opportunity to pick and choose which recommendations that they wanted to implement. And so we took the information from Sally Malone, Ms. Greta McLean, and Mark, Board Member Wynn, and then some other recommendations. And I was reviewing these policies because Ms. Greta came to our board and talked about some issues and how we could all work collaboratively together. And so over a course of about a month or so, I kept reading over that policy. It was a lengthy it was a lot of work that our team had put in. And then it was, I sat down with him and we decided that creating the policy for the police department would be the right thing to do. And that's why you only saw one recommendation, because there's no other option. This is the policy, right? And this is a policy that is a best practice policy. It's I believe it's a tried and true policy, and this city would be remiss by not implementing this. Not just adopting it, but implementing it and training the officers on it. because of course it's been, we've had the End Violence Against Women International's executive director take a look at it and add information. We've had the Office of Family Safety Center, take a look and add their information. And so it's continued to go on, and many of you may have even added your information to it and feedback. And so, but I agree with you. Like, I do. I believe, like, anytime you're trying to change culture and implement things that are going to, and policies that are going to challenge what they've done for the last 25, 30 years, it could be difficult. But that's where, the leadership of this city have to step in. They have to be brave and courageous to do this work. And of course, I think that we all welcome community involvement here. That's why we're having this public forum. So thank you for your comments. Appreciate it.
Greetings. I want to commend you for this report, and also thank Silent No Longer that brought, at least for those of us who are not connected to police departments, this issue to the forefront of the city. Michelle and Board Member Wynn kind of answered my questions, or at least proposed my questions. My question is more so in relation to that, is that how do you, to Michelle's point, how do you force a momentum shifting push with this report so that it just doesn't sit there and it's not ignored? And I make that question, ask that question because some of the groups that I think a year ago, 2 years ago, had this report come out that we wanted to push John Cooper, are not going to want to push Mayor Freddie O'Connell because of their closeness and proximity to him, honestly. But I know that when the Drive On Black report came out in 2016, they presented the report to Metro Council. I don't know if it was a special call meeting. And then later on, I think the policing project from NYU presented it to Metro Council. And what the Drive On Black report did in presenting it to council was it gave, at least policing at that moment, a mandate politically to address, and that was in October 2016 or somewhere around there, November 2016. And so I'm wondering, as a momentum shifting action, if there's a way that this report could be presented to council members in a special call meeting of some sorts that the city could see as a kind of momentum shifting impact, so that this report could have some momentum and fuel behind it, rather than just being ignored by city leadership or being ignored by groups that we think are going to stand up, but they're not really going to stand up. They think they're going to speak out, but they're not going to speak out. And I just want to make sure I encourage, I hope to see that, because I think that will make a difference in getting the report into the minds and the hearts of everyone here in Nashville.
Let me just respond to just a few of the things that you talked about. And I think one of the benefits we've got here in Nashville is we have a police department that historically has done some pretty innovative things. In 81, 82, Nashville was one of the first police departments to actually create a sex crimes unit within the police department. And it was specialists with advocates who worked in that sex crimes unit. It was groundbreaking. There weren't many of them in the country. Fast forward to the early 90s, we created a domestic violence division to deal with the numbers of murder women in Nashville, which was pretty innovative as well. And we've never had a male commander of that division until John DeRay was made captain. He became the first. And well, I think it's pretty symbolic, because there's a view of crime against women that it's only women's work, it's not men's work. So the chief ran the division, and so he understands this topic well. He's no novice here. Now that he's chief, and I have had conversations with him about it, but I know him, and I know his heart. He's a good man. I don't think he would resist this at all, because he understands, because he's the chief and he's a member of IACP, that IACP which is the International Association of Chiefs of Police, is promoting different kind of policing. It's reimagining police. It's not abolishing police. When you reimagine police, you look at all the things like bias in policing. You look at things like privilege in policing. And this is not just a policy about the sexual assault of female officers in the communities, and I don't want to disregard male officers, they can be sexually abused as well. But this is culture change. And if you look at what Ansley and Dylan have done in their proposal, they've added correctly the need for Metro to adhere to the 30 by 30 program, which means that American policing is far behind the Canadians, the Australians, and the British, and the military in their numbers of women in policing. The only way you can get women in policing, and we've had conversations all over the country about this, why would a young woman coming out of college with a college debt want to get into public service when they know they may be facing a hostile, sexual abusive police department? They're not, they're too smart, they're moving on. So law enforcement understands that. Chief Reagan understands that as well. So in order to change the environment so women can come into policing, there has to be a culture change. And this is about culture change. Because if you think about it, when you heard the presentation, it's about sexual coercion of women. That's male privilege. So when you talk about someone's privilege taken away from them, that's when they start to fight and resist. And for instance, white privilege is a real thing. Blue privilege, to me, blue privilege is a real thing. So when you take away privilege, you're taking away someone's power. And to your statement earlier, this is, I think, some early steps of us changing the culture inside a police department that's not unique in police departments nationwide, but this is the first step. So, 20 years from now, if we see 30, 40% women in police, we know we've done a good job, because that represents a diverse population in national. And you can't just keep policing in the community with a male, white, dominated law enforcement agency. It just doesn't work. Ask the people of Ferguson, ask the people of Milwaukee, ask the people of Baltimore, ask the people of Philadelphia, and they'll tell you what happens when you have a department that didn't look like a community. All it needs is one spark, and then the community's pushed back 30 or 40 years in the relations with the community. So I think this is not just a policy about sex assault. This is sort of the first moment for us as a community, an oversight board, and review board, to say we won't change in the department, but let's look at long-lasting change, and that's a culture change. And we're not in disagreement with the leadership of IACP, or the National Sheriff's Association, or the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Leaders, or HERF, or any of the other groups in the country who look at these strategic issues in policing. So this is the first step. But we're in a good spot. I think Angela's in a good spot for us to start this. And once we get that, we can talk about use of force, we can talk about hiring, we can talk about a lot